The courtroom was dead silent, but the judge's voice echoed like thunder. "Good morning, Colonel." The words cut through the room so sharply that even the ceiling fans seemed to freeze. For a second, nobody moved. Not the clock, not the high-priced attorneys, and definitely not my mother-in-law, Evelyn Carter. She had been smiling only moments before. That polished country club smile she wore whenever she thought she had already won. But the instant the judge called me Colonel, that smile cracked completely. Her face turned pale beneath layers of expensive makeup, and she stared at me like she was looking at a ghost. I kept my hands folded calmly on the table. After 20 years in military courtrooms, I had learned a very valuable lesson. The loudest person in the room usually has the weakest case, and Evelyn had been loud for a very long time. 3 months earlier, I was standing in my kitchen making soup when the certified mail arrived. It was raining heavily that afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia, the kind of cold spring rain that settles deep into your bones. The envelope carried the return address of a massive corporate legal group. I already knew it was trouble, because ever since my husband Frank passed away, his family had treated me like an enemy. At first it was small things. Evelyn criticized the funeral flowers I chose, complained that I sold Frank's old boat too quickly, and told relatives I was acting emotionally unstable whenever I disagreed with her. But after a while, the fake politeness disappeared completely. Money has a way of stripping the paint off people, especially old family money. I opened the letter slowly at the kitchen counter, while the stove hummed behind me. The legal terms blurred together at first. Listing petitions for estate review, allegations of undue influence, and property disputes. I had to sit down because I knew exactly what this was really about. Frank's lake house was the crown jewel of his inheritance. It sat on a quiet stretch of Smith Mountain, lake where we had spent almost every single summer for over 3 decades. It was not a mansion, just an old cedar cabin with creaky floors and a dock. Frank rebuilt with his own hands, but it was the one place my husband had truly been happy. Toward the end of his battle with cancer, the lake house became the only place he could sleep peacefully. He would sit on the dock wrapped in an old navy blanket while I read beside him. And now Evelyn wanted to take it away. According to the lawsuit, she intended to prove that I manipulated her dying son into leaving the property to me. I laughed quietly when I finished reading, not because it was funny, but because after 62 years on this earth, betrayal becomes so predictable it almost loses its power to shock you. People often assume quiet women are weak, especially women my age. You become invisible in America after a certain point, and people talk down to you like you are helpless. I did not mind the invisibility most days, but Evelyn mistook my silence for helplessness. And that was her first mistake. "You should just settle," my daughter Anna told me that evening. We sat at my kitchen table while the rain tapped softly against the windows, and Anna looked completely exhausted by her own life. "I do not want you going through this kind of intense stress," she said quietly, reminding me that Grandma Evelyn had millions of dollars, powerful connections, and teams of aggressive lawyers. I stirred my tea slowly and listened to her explain how Evelyn claimed the house belonged strictly in the Carter bloodline. I looked up at my daughter and told her calmly that I was Frank's family, but she still looked terrified. Truthfully, I understood her fear because most people had absolutely no idea what I used to do before I retired. Even my own daughter knew only small pieces of my past. Frank and I had agreed long ago to keep my military career private outside of close circles. After years of handling military tribunals, overseas investigations, and enough human ugliness to last several lifetimes, I just wanted peace. I wanted gardens, books, and quiet coffee on the porch. I wanted to become ordinary again, and I succeeded until Evelyn dragged me into court. A week later, Evelyn invited the entire family over for Sunday dinner, which told me she was planning a performance. Her home overlooked the river with massive white columns and polished silverware, the kind of place where nobody ever relaxes. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension. Frank's brother Richard barely looked at me, and his wife offered me one of those tight little smiles wealthy people use when they are pretending to be polite. Dinner dragged on through, passive-aggressive comments disguised as genuine family concern, and they all expected me to break under the pressure. "You must be overwhelmed financially now," Evelyn said while cutting her roast, mentioning how expensive legal matters could become. I sipped my water calmly and replied that I was managing just fine. Across the table, Richard smirked and muttered that his father always intended the lake property to stay with them. I looked directly at him and said Frank made his final wishes very clear, but Evelyn just dabbed her lips with a napkin and smiled. She leaned back in her chair and told me my problem was that I always acted smarter than everyone else. when I was really just a housewife. The room went completely silent, and that statement actually hurt more than the entire lawsuit. It did not hurt my pride, but it hurt because Frank had known exactly who I was and respected the sacrifices I made for this country. I set my fork down carefully, looked her in the eyes, and told her I would see her in court. Evelyn just laughed softly and told me I was finished. That night, I sat alone on my porch, listening to distant thunder. And for the first time in months, I opened the old leather case in my closet containing my military records and Silver Eagle insignia. The morning of the hearing, I woke up long before sunrise without needing an alarm clock. My body simply remembered the feeling of pressure before my mind fully caught up. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark with a cup of black coffee, staring at the plain brown leather folder sitting beside my mug. Military law taught me that the people most desperate to appear powerful always carry the biggest binders. I dressed simply in gray slacks and a dark coat, tying my silver hair back neatly before checking the mirror. I looked like an ordinary widow, which was absolutely perfect. I climbed the courthouse steps slowly, careful with my aching knees. When Anna hurried toward me looking incredibly anxious, she asked if I was okay, and I gave her a faint smile as she glanced toward the entrance nervously. "They are already inside," she whispered, warning me that people like Evelyn always arrive early when they expect a public victory. Anna begged me one last time to settle because I could lose everything. But I reminded her that her father absolutely hated arrogant bullies who used influence like a weapon, and we entered the lobby together. Evelyn stood near the security checkpoint wearing a designer suit and pearls large enough to pay off a mortgage. Richard stood beside her alongside 3 expensive, polished lawyers carrying thick trial binders. Evelyn spotted me immediately and laughed loudly enough for nearby people to hear, mocking me for actually showing up. One of the attorneys looked around for my legal counsel, and when he realized I was completely alone, his expression changed. Richard asked if I forgot to hire a lawyer, and Evelyn stepped closer, her expensive perfume hitting me as she whispered that I should have taken the settlement. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, smelling of dust and old paper. I sat alone at the defense table while Evelyn's legal team spread materials across theirs, like they were preparing for a corporate merger. The hearing began exactly at 9, and Judge Harold Bennett entered the room. He was a former Navy Reserve officer with sharp eyes and disciplined posture. The moment I saw him, I recognized him from a military tribunal in Germany decades ago. He scanned the courtroom casually, but the moment his eyes landed on me, he stopped completely, and a strange silence followed as recognition settled on his face. Evelyn's attorney stood up first and launched immediately into a dramatic performance about undue influence over a terminally ill man. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, using loaded phrasing and calling me a financially dependent widow who isolated her husband. Anna shifted angrily behind me because we both knew. Frank asked for distance from his family because cancer makes you tired, and Evelyn never stopped talking. The attorney finished confidently, expecting me to burst into tears, but I simply organized my papers. Judge Bennett looked toward me and asked if I would be representing myself today. I said yes, and Evelyn smiled with immense satisfaction from across the room. The judge studied me for another moment, and then his expression changed entirely as he stood up a little straighter. The room fell strangely still before he gave me a small, respectful nod and uttered those fateful words. "Good morning, Colonel." Evelyn's smile vanished instantly, and behind me, I heard Anna whisper in total shock. The opposing attorney cleared his throat awkwardly and stammered that he was not aware I had legal experience, but the judge replied that his statement was a massive understatement. I folded my hands calmly on top of the table, and for the first time since Frank died, I saw pure fear enter Evelyn's eyes. The court reporter stopped typing, and nobody moved as the judge explained to the confused lawyers that I was a retired colonel who had served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for over 2 decades. Evelyn stared at me like I had committed a crime, demanding to know why I told her I worked for the government. I replied calmly that I did, and the judge sharply told her to direct her comments through her counsel. The opposing attorney tried to regain his confidence, arguing that my military background was completely irrelevant to the property dispute. That part was technically true, but credibility matters everywhere, especially in a court of law. The attorney resumed speaking, but his rhythm had changed completely, and he sounded like someone stepping carefully through a dark room. When he attempted to frame me as manipulative again, I stood up slowly and interrupted him politely. I looked at him and asked if he had interviewed the oncology nurses, reviewed the hospice records, or spoken with Frank's doctor. The attorney hesitated and admitted he had done none of those things. I nodded once and sat back down, having completely dismantled his argument without ever raising my voice. The best prosecutors do not yell. They ask small, precise questions that slowly remove any place to hide. Judge Bennett allowed us to submit preliminary evidence, and while the younger attorney across from me looked relieved to see my thin folder, that relief disappeared the moment I submitted a notarized estate protection letter signed 8 months before Frank's death. Frank had explicitly stated that the lake house belonged solely to me and that any attempts to contest ownership went completely against his wishes. The attorney's face tightened, and Evelyn looked absolutely stunned as she whispered that it was impossible. I looked directly at her and said it was simply inconvenient for her. The judge called for a short recess, and the moment everyone stood up, Evelyn marched over furiously and called me a manipulative woman. The judge warned her sharply from the bench, and Richard quickly approached, nervously asking if we could discuss settlement options now. An hour earlier they wanted war, and now they wanted to negotiate. I told him his brother had already made his decision, and during the recess, Anna sat beside me trembling. She asked if I was really a colonel who prosecuted military crimes, staring at me in complete disbelief. I touched her hand gently and told her I just wanted to be ordinary after I retired because I was tired of courtrooms deciding people's futures. But life has a strange way of dragging us back toward old battlefields. When we least expect it, when court resumed, I submitted our email correspondence showing that Frank had threatened to restrict Evelyn's hospital visitation if she kept pressuring him about the property. Anna wept quietly behind me, and Evelyn looked absolutely furious as the truth came to light. Real courtroom victories do not feel triumphant. They just feel heavy, and I felt incredibly tired, because my husband had spent his final months protecting me from his own mother. Evelyn's attorneys began arguing with her in whispers, realizing she had completely failed to disclose the full story to them. Then came the final fracture when I submitted the audio recordings of the phone calls Evelyn made to Frank while he was sick. Her cold, sharp voice filled the courtroom, demanding that he put the lake house back in the family name if I really loved him. The entire room froze as Frank's exhausted voice answered weakly, begging her to stop. Judge Bennett stopped the recording, looked at Evelyn, and stated the court now had serious concerns regarding fraudulent conduct and coercive interference. Just like that, the Carter family empire began collapsing in public. The judge denied their petition in full, declaring that the property remained solely under my ownership, and let them know that criminal fraud exposure could be considered next. Outside the courthouse, I ignored the local reporters and hugged my crying daughter. Across the plaza, Evelyn stood completely alone, her hands trembling as her lawyers walked away. I walked over to her, and she small-voicedly asked why I was showing her mercy. I looked at the sky and told her that mercy reveals character, and she had already lost the only thing that mattered. 3 months later, the lake house finally felt quiet and healed. I stood on the dock one morning, holding a cup of coffee while the fog drifted across the silver water, realizing the battle had never been about revenge. It was about protecting love from being rewritten by bitterness. People may easily underestimate quiet souls and mistake kindness for weakness, but dignity always has a strange way of revealing itself when it matters most. If this story touched your heart tonight, please share it with someone who needs to remember their own quiet strength. Please like and subscribe my channel if you loved your military.